Well, like if they built near a stream and if they didn't.
Not coming, right?
No.
That's
she was
correct.
Absent today.
She is unfortunately detained.
Give me 1 second. I'm ready when you're ready, Mayor. I don't know, but I saw some photos. We'll use the photos. It looks to me from the photos.
Okay, so before we get started, as I usually do, if you have a cell phone, please silence it or turn it off. I will call to order the work session for the Oregon City Commission Wednesday, October 16th, 2019. Call the roll.
Commissioner Frank O'Donnell.
Here.
Commissioner Rocky Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Denise McGriff.
Present?
Mayor Dan Holliday.
Here. So the only item we have tonight is 19-58 Oregon City Municipal Code, Section 12.04.120, street sidewalks and public places. Obstructions and prospective amendment language allowing cluster or global approval of revocable long-term obstructions in the Keniama Historic District's right-of-way. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. So tonight, we want to talk to you a little bit about the encroachments in the McLaughlin neighborhood, and this
Keniama neighborhood?
Keniama neighborhood. We have some in the McLaughlin neighborhood too, by the way, but we're focused on Keniama tonight.
One can of worms closed for right now.
Yeah, Claudia, are you pulling up that presentation?
Yep.
So, short presentation, just really want to talk through this. This came up with regard to the fence on Ganong Street, and just, I don't know if it was good thinking on my part or not, but sharing a more detailed slide that showed the number of encroachments in the Keniama neighborhood, and there are many. And so most of those are aged, have been there for a very, very long time. So tonight I just kind of wanted to go through the encroachment process, just to share with you that process. give you if someone came in and wanted to make an encroachment, I want to make sure you understand what we do today for that, and then talk a little bit about some of the encroachments. And then we put together this memo that really articulates some options there, and we wanted to keep them pretty straightforward. I suppose there's a variety of other ways you could pull that together, but we kind of boiled it down to 4 options, so we'll go through that as well. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and talk through just what we do in the engineering group when someone comes to us with a request for an encroachment. And this is happening from time to time, especially in Kenema, because again, we've got wide rights of way, typically 60-foot rights of way. In some cases, and I think I listed the alleyways as 12.5 feet, and then I went back and measured them after I wrote the commission report. They're more like 12 feet, but there's unimproved right-of-ways in Kenema as well. Those have been platted for a very long time. So anyway, if a property owner comes to us with a request for something to be in the public right-of-way as part of their new development or an existing development, we ask them to submit the details on what that request might be. We'll review that internally and make a determination whether it's in the public interest, and that's kind of sometimes can be a challenge because it's typically serving a particular property, but it's serving it in a safe way, which could be in the public interest. So we're definitely looking for safety. We're looking for impacts through some of our overlay districts. Specifically for us, it's usually the geologic hazards concerns, but there's also NROD and historic concerns that go along with that. If we determine that it's in the public interest, we'll recommend to the property owner that they continue to proceed, and we really suggest that they put together the right information for an application. And if we determine that it's not in the public interest, we'll also counsel them on that so that they're not wasting a lot of time or money putting together an application package. And for the most part, if we're letting them know that we wouldn't recommend it as staff, they usually come to the conclusion that they're probably not going to be very successful with that. For the most part, we've had our recommendations have come before the city commission on encroachments have been approved. So if they do move forward and they submit an application, there's also fees associated with that, and I'll talk through that in detail so you understand some of the fees. But I'll come back to that. So we process the fee, process the application. There's quite a few things that we're asking for now: a covenant of maintenance and a release from indemnity for the city. Sometimes we ask them to insure it if we think that there's maybe the potential that there's, I don't know, trip hazard, slip hazard, vehicle, concerns, even if they're just anything that gets close to something that we might, more recently we've been talking to our risk folks about, well, should we have these facilities insured? So, but we definitely ask the property owners today for an indemnity release. And then we put it on your commission schedule and, take that through the commission approval process. And I've got really a complete application that I wanted to show you as well, but we'll go through the process. You have to adopt a resolution allowing that. And it is a revocable long-term obstruction permit, so it can be revoked. And the city has the right to remove that. I don't know of an instance where that has happened, but the city still has the right to do that, and that's why it's revocable. The city records that covenant and maintenance and indemnity form, and so it's recorded on the property, so future property owners know about it as well. And then we issue a permit that really kind of lays out the details of, how it's constructed, when it's constructed, those kind of things. So our permit fees are based on a fee schedule that you've adopted. And so that application, usually, especially in cases where there's question about whether or not the commission would approve that, we charge them for their application, we charge them for the plan review, and we, if we're recommending it, we're preparing a resolution and document process. Oh, let me step back. If we've looked at it closely and think that there's not a high chance of success, we probably wouldn't even charge them the $52 charge. So we try and take a quick look at it just to make sure we think it's got potential. But that last revocable right-of-way permit, we won't issue that unless the commission authorizes the resolution. But it's still, I think, a significant investment for a property owner to apply and get the revocable right-of-way. Can you pull up that PDF? I'm going to real quickly show, this is an, so again, you don't need to read this, but there's a permit that's actually issued that includes all the fees that they've paid and clarification on that. That comes out of our new permit system. So the forms are much nicer, may have some details on when they build it or traffic control, those kinds of things. The resolution's attached to that. Usually a site map, a location map, a more specific map, and then an aerial photograph. Usually a description of the what it is, whether it's a stairwell or a stairway or an entrance of some sort like that. Those have been the more predominant ones. A rock wall, for instance, that's what this one is about, is building a rock wall in the public right-of-way. Depending on the sophistication of the applicant, this is actually a pretty good job that they did with a landscaper who actually kind of put together a site plan, a very good site plan, and then all the details associated with the wall. That's just our standard street section. The geotechnical report, if they're in a geologic hazards area, and that's pretty much everywhere in Kenema, so they would have a geologic hazards report. And in many cases, they have been associated with a development, so there may be already some fees that have been paid for geologic hazards review. If not, there may be charges associated with that would be over and above those fees that I showed you. So this is the full geotechnical report. Again, just drawings associated with the actual construction of that facility and specifications. So this is the maintenance covenant and revocable right-of-way permit, and you can see this one has a recording sticker on the top of it from the Clackamas County Recorder's Office. So that's our that's kind of our standard package today, and especially when they're involving a geologic hazard permit. So if I could go through just some examples today in preparing for this, I really just kind of wanted to share with you some of the kinds of things that are around the Kenema neighborhood that would fall under this kind of scenario where there's facilities in the right-of-way that, as far as we know, they're not permitted. Now, I haven't looked at the permits yet. I just kind of went through and looked at Street View and looked at some of those dots that we included in that original for the locations, just to kind of show those. So the picture on the left is obviously a picture of the property and shows some of the encroachments. The picture on the left is really the site itself. And so I can point to it, and maybe, Claudia, can you kind of use the cursor to, so we're really looking at this area right here. Yeah.
Whoops.
Did I do that?
Probably.
Sorry. So we're looking at this area right here. The right-of-way line is way back here. This is an unimproved right-of-way, so it's kind of shown in gray, and then their house. So the facilities that are in the right-of-way here, there's a water feature right here that's built in the right-of-way, there's a stairway that's built in the right-of-way, and there's rockery walls, terracing that's built in the right-of-way. So that's kind of the example of the kind of things that are in this particular piece of right-of-way. The one below, again, looking at this building right here that's in the unimproved through right away. This is McLaughlin Boulevard, so there's no street connection through there, but this building right here, in the photograph is this building right here. So that's another facility that is in the city's
You
public
said that's in
right-of-way.
the right of way?
Yes.
That doesn't even meet any standards in Kenema.
Again, just I'm gonna just point the picture at the front porch, but this house is on private property, but the property line's right on the edge of the house. So this little structure that was added as an entryway is in the public right of way. And just noticed, some of the decorative fences look really nice down there, by the way. They do meet the design standards, but they're well into the right of way. And there's a lot of that kind of thing that's in the right of way. This property here, this whole front porch is an add-on, and it's in the right of way. This property here, again, most of this stairway and parking facility, there's another little, I'm not sure what that is, but, most of this, or all of this is in the right of way here. And in this case here, there's a very old wall, but it's my belief that that wall was built as part of the driveway approach for the house that sits on top, which again is a historic home. It's been there a very, very long time, but it's in the right of way. These facilities like the stairway, this retaining wall system, there's another stairway behind it. All those are in the public right of way. This building right here, that little addition is in the public right of way.
I think we get the message.
This building right here is in the right of way. That's my last one. Sorry.
Which one was that? In that last picture, you said
The garage.
the picture on the
garage.
bottom?
The garage.
Oh, that one, okay.
Yeah. So, in the memo, we've outlined 4 options, and really, I think the simple way is we could pursue these kinds of examples, we could pursue them individually, and provide and follow code enforcement on each of those structures. Before we would do that, though, we would spend a fair amount of time looking at the case itself, right? Making sure there was no permit that was issued, validating that, looking at, well, what's the risk of that facility? Is it in, are there overlay districts that matter? What's kind of the history of that? To the degree we can tell, some of these we're not going to have much information on history other than historic photos. Surveys, as we know in Kenema, can be challenging, and a lot of the monumentation doesn't exist. So that's a general statement. I have never really looked in many of these areas to know exactly what's monumented and what's not. I think our aerial photos that we show in our GIS system is relatively accurate, and it aligns pretty well with fence lines and those kind of things, but still would need to do a survey. Was there a properly approved process when they, trying to figure out that history? That might be something that we would do. And then, there's always the ownership history, because I suspect most of these owners that are in these houses now didn't own them when those structures were built. So trying to figure that out. So that's one approach, taking them one by one and kind of moving through that conversation, both with the commission and amongst ourselves and with the property owner. So, we see that as time consuming and likely to raise more questions than answers. But if that's the way we're directed, we could do that. The other option is to grant a right-of-way permit, more of a a blanket kind of right-of-way permit that would be a single action by the commission to allow these encroachments to remain. It sounds easy. It sounds easier. I'm just worried about the complexities of what that might do later. And the third option is really about, if we're going to do that kind of thing, should we also amend the code to so that we can do our best to stay within compliance of the code. And, so I like the idea because of the staff time or limited amount of staff time that it would take to deal with a situation like that. But I'm also, somewhat concerned about what that could mean for other encroachments, not only in the Kenema neighborhood, but, part of me sees beyond the Kenema neighborhood because we've got, other areas where this same kind of approach would probably apply. And, I think the code amendments are likely to affect things like the historic overlay. How do we provide exemptions for that? The geologic hazards, which is, usually got a fair amount of risk associated with it. How do we deal with those? Some of the encroachments that I looked at aren't heavy in geologic hazards, but they're in the geologic hazard overlay. So, we don't have really a shortcut way of getting through that. So, we may have to do that. And the last is really where I landed, which is the do nothing option. And I tell you why I like that is because many of these have not been problematic for the city. They may not be, as people get attentive, as we draw attention to these problems, I understand how, then all of a sudden it's like, what are they doing in our right of way? They should be out. And there may be some of those that are more impactful than others. I looked at that temporary structure that's on McLaughlin. To me, that one's one of those that's, wow, how did that ever happen? And, that's a little bit different than, say, a front porch, for instance. But, but I still like the idea of doing this. This issue arose out of a neighborhood dispute. And that neighborhood dispute is what really is, I think, what's inspiring this. And while I get the city is responsible for managing the right of way, but these are, and I think we're doing an excellent job of that, by the way, now, but these are historic things that have been around for a very, very long time. And there are things that don't, I've been here 16 years now. They've never come up as an issue that warrants a necessity to change. So there's that. I mean, there's the other end of this, which is a lot of the work in dealing with these encroachments going to land in, I think, both Laura and my departments. I know there's so much good work that we need to get done that we would have to we'd have to prioritize and really kind of hear from you where those priorities lay, because these are time consuming things that I think, I'd much rather be pursuing other work that has much more impact on the community. So, I'm advocating for the do nothing option, or the adjourn and not initiate further action on longstanding encroachments. That sounds so much better than the do nothing option.
We're going to talk about this now. Questions, comments?
I have a question, please.
Commissioner McGrath.
Mr. John Lewis, sir, would you, for the benefit of the public, talk about what is the public interest? Just so that it's out there in the public domain, because it could mean different things to different people. And so how is the city interpreting what the public interest is? And so when you're making a decision, we're looking at what is in the public interest and what is not. And I think that would be my question for now.
Let me think about that one.
Do we have it defined in code or judgment call?
It is not defined in code.
Okay.
Well, I think, one is looking at the safety. What's the safety? What's the risk associated with what's being proposed? How's that right-of-way being utilized? Is it something that we're going to need in the future for infrastructure, street connectivity, pedestrian connectivity, bike connectivity? Or is it, one of those old, plats that were dropped on regardless of topography where the right-of-way, is never going to go through, and it's half of a street, that goes straight up a cliff or up a very steep slope. So I think those are all trying to balance the public interest of, our public right-of-ways are our biggest, one of our most valuable resources that we have. And how do we manage those effectively for the benefit of the public who owns that? And is this a high-use right-of-way or a high-use potential, or is this really something that isn't going to be used historically? A car's been parked there, or a garden has been planted there. Is that going to detract and take away from the public need for that to the benefit of the community? So, yeah, it's not as easy as click, if you can check these 5 boxes, it is or it isn't. Every one of these is so unique based on topography, location, use, future planning, that all those go into, how you decide what's in the public interest with our rights of way.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
So the key word in this ongoing discussion is revocable, and that means revocable at any time, now or in any time in the future. So keep that in mind during this discussion. So we've identified 78 encroachments. How we've identified them, I don't know. I don't know if they are permitted or discovered, and it really doesn't matter. They exist. I want to keep in mind the historical nature of Kenema. I mean, its streets are 20 feet wide, a 60-foot right-of-way. I don't ever see us changing the historical nature of Kenema. I don't see us widening those streets. I don't see us putting, Kenema is historically what it is. I'm not a guy to do nothing, so I'm not interested in option number 4.
I'm not either.
Do nothing is like abdicating your duty as a commissioner. So we're going to do something, and we're going to, right or wrong, we're going to do something. Or at least I would like to. I actually like the concept of a global
Me too.
deal. However, my only concern on that is the compliance with other applicable standards, whether they be the historic overlay, the geological hazards, utilities, natural resources, flood management. So I don't know, one of the propositions you put forth in the 4 proposals was almost like a fast track review. A quick review is like, do we anticipate any immediate work, and are the utilities involved? I mean, something that we don't have people do something only to have it removed in a very short time later under the revocable permit. So I like a global type thing with a fast track review. The thing I want to make sure that I understand, and this has to do with that, and whether it's a structure or a fence or whatever we put in the right of way, and the fence is a good example. I don't want any catch-22s that a structure in the right of way does not have to comply with the same rules that it would have to comply with if it were on private property. And do you understand my concern for that? The fence specifically is it. I mean, does a fence have to be 3.5 feet if it's on a private property? But if you put it out in the right of way, the same fence can be 6 feet. That's my question. Is that true? If something's in a right of way, are all other bets off that the only action this city has is to revoke the permit?
So the way a lot of these rules are written are specific to on private property. When it comes to fences, we've always considered them the same. We haven't necessarily approved a right-of-way encroachment that has a fence that's out of compliance with what would be required on private property.
So our code now, for the environmental overlay districts, it really doesn't distinguish the difference between on private property or not. Those triggers for environmental compliance or historic compliance really don't distinguish the difference between the two. As far as fences specifically, our code does not have a height limit for fences in the right of way, and it does have a height limit for those on private property. I think the difference between option 2 and 3 in this is, what are you going to do about those up to 5 overlay districts that still apply on top of this right of way permit? Are we going to deal with them now, or just let it ride and either deal with code enforcement later, or actively pursue code enforcement on those environmental portions of these?
Well, my question is, excuse me.
Go, please do.
My question is I assume that the houses that have been newly built down there, say in the last 10 or 15 years, have gone through all that permitting and stuff, right?
I sure hope so.
Including the environmental overlays and all the other.
That's the thing with this, is we didn't do the analysis on all of the encroachments, so you don't really know what's in that.
Well, I'm getting to a point here. So the stuff that's been built in the last 20 years, at some point went through some kind of a process in order to get their building permits.
Maybe.
If they got building permits.
Well, I can't
We're
imagine you
hedging.
could
They-
build
they should have, yes.
a new structure, I mean, like a new house,
Sure,
without
yes.
getting a building permit.
Yes.
So the rest of it, down the line, are buildings that have been there for, many years, if not many decades.
Right.
So how are we going to go back and, enforce an environmental overlay or an NROD or something else on a place that's been there for 60, 70, maybe 120 years?
That's part of the dilemma.
Well, yeah.
Is trying to figure out, one, when it was constructed,
Right.
what code was in place when it was constructed.
Well, and I think more importantly, the fact is that as Commissioner O'Donnell said, we don't intend to change Kenema's streets anytime soon, probably ever. So it's so hard to go back in a neighborhood this old and try to enforce something that, has come up in the last 20 or 30 years.
I agree.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Well, as you well know, in my previous dealings with the commission as a private citizen, I'm the last person to be in favor of what's called ex post facto or retroactive law. And Tony's comment about when is that law established versus when was this work done is very to the point and very considered. But if I understood what Ms. Turway just said, it actually, correct me, please. If a fence would be not in compliance on private property, but that same fence is in a right-of-way, there's no action, it's not in compliance because it's in a right-of-way. Did I understand what you said correctly? Because that's what it sounded like to me.
There's up to 7 reasons why I wouldn't be in compliance. One,
In a right-of-way.
Yeah, it's either it didn't get approval under up to 5 overlay districts, you didn't get your encroachment permit, or you don't meet our actual code for fence height. So some of those are the same, whether it's public or private, and some of those are different.
So the historic overlay district applies whether you're on private or public property?
It does.
Okay, well, that helps me with this other issue that sometime we'll probably end up revisiting.
Commissioner McGriff?
Yeah, I wanted to just make a couple of suggestions. I will say that I concur with my fellow commissioners that number 4 is not an option for me either. I know that we have had codes in effect, and I don't want anyone to feel like we are picking on the Kenema neighborhood, because some of you may or may not know, but on the 29th of October, there's going to be a meeting in the McLaughlin neighborhood area to talk about the survey that was done of the McLaughlin Promenade. We have some of the same issues there, being that, example, this summer, somebody decided to build a fire pit in part of the park. And we knew that that was not on private property. It was definitely in the park, and it was removed. So it's in many places, not just in Kenema, but one of the things I want to bring up is that I don't want to have this pursued through code enforcement for each obstruction. What I think I would like to see is maybe a sort of a windshield survey approach, because I couldn't support doing a blanket. I don't know what we're dealing with. I don't know what the unintended consequences are. So if we had some ability, maybe street by street over a period of 6 to 8 months, look at what the categories are. So there's, let's say it's a fence category, there's a building category, there's a other category, or whatever it is, and maybe figure out what types of issues that there are. That would give us a better sense of what we're dealing with. I think taking that approach on a sort of a minimal category type basis would help us understand what we are dealing with. The other thing that I have a concern about is the fact that the city of Oregon City, since its inception probably into the late 20s and 30s, we've had building permits. We used to have a record at the planning department of building permits that were issued in the 30s and 40s, be it that they were 3x5 cards, but it told us something. So I'm hoping all of that information got translated to our computer. So we do know whether or not properties may or may not have had building permits. The only way that I would be interested in pursuing any code compliance would be if somebody did not have a building permit to build a shed or whatever it is, that building structure of some sort we would kind of kindly ask them to get it permitted or move it or take it down or whatever it is, wherever it is in the city, not just Kenema. And then once we had some idea of what those categories were, we could do something like, okay, if they're all of these types, yes, maybe we could say, as of this date, these are exempt. Others, they're not going to be able to be exempt. I mean, I think you showed a couple of pictures of things, and those buildings look pretty new to me within the last 10 or 15 years. And I think we just have to deal with people on an individual basis and say, hey, you know, by the way, maybe you didn't know where your property lines were, but gee, your building is kind of here. I don't know about the ones on McLaughlin Boulevard, that's ODOT, and we can't exempt anything. But I think one of the things that's to be noted is that many neighborhoods have overlays. And it's been my understanding and the way that I have been told is that the most restrictive code applies. So the issue of a fence being one height in the right-of-way and one height somewhere else, that's not the most restrictive code. The most restrictive code is the one that deals with the historic overlay. And I think that fences in the right-of-way need to be treated the same no matter where they are, whether on public or private, because I think it's too inconsistent. And as Commissioner O'Donnell said, that other issue, we may be coming back and looking at that. But I don't want this to be, you know, punitive to anyone unless they really have kind of skirted the issue and built something without a permit. And again, there's a way to not be punitive. We get them to come in and get it resolved. But I can't support a blanket. So I'm kind of looking at a combination. You've got GIS. You wouldn't have to physically go out unless, you know, you want to physically go out. I always recommend to staff, please go out and look at it, because sometimes what you see on a map, on a GIS thing is not the same as when you see it in real life. But we did sort of a windshield survey approach, got categories, come back in a few months and say, well, this is what we found so far. I think we could take some action, but I think we would be shirking our responsibility if we just said, well, we're not going to do anything.
Okay, so I'm really more towards the, I guess maybe third option, that is a blanket kind of approach for Kenema.
She's new.
She's new, yeah.
She is, yes.
But to Commissioner O'Donnell's point, you know, are we going to go back 15 years? Somebody, you know, I mean, I lived in the McLaughlin neighborhood. I lived at the corner of 13th and Monroe. And Monroe, or 13th, you know, is a 90% slope. So that was never going to get built. And we had a garden there, and it was our side yard, and had a hedge planted in front of it. When we found out that we heard that somebody was going to try to build something in that spot, we got with the neighbors and we did a street vacation for 13th Street. But prior to investigating that, I had no idea that that wasn't part of the house, that wasn't part of the property. So I think I'm leaning more towards position 3 with a collective permit for, revocable permit for Kenema, plus the looking at the environmental overlay.
I think the one part that's, you know, we can certainly come up with off GIS and windshield, we could probably get a pretty good estimate of where the encroachments are and what they are. The trick is going to be then trying to figure out when it was constructed.
Right, and what's it going to cost in staff time? I mean, we haven't budgeted for this, and
No,
this
we have
looks
not.
like a big project
This
to
is
me.
a significant project, depending on how far we want to go.
Right.
2 fences could be built identically the same, but 40 years apart. And you know, we might not have had geologic hazard code when it was constructed, or we might not have had the overlay district the way we did. I mean, so just that's the importance of trying to understand when it was constructed relative to what was the code at the time, right? Because that's what they're entitled to. After that, they become pre-existing non-conforming, and there are things that kick in if they decide to change that. So I think it's really trying to get an understanding of how in depth do we want to go is really going to drive the time and the cost associated with this.
And paid interns.
Well, I think we've beat this horse to death, and I don't know that the staff's got any direction at this point.
Well, we got rid of number 4 and 1.
4 and 1.
4 and 1.
Somewhere in between.
So it sounds like we're somewhere in between of maybe focusing on maybe getting an understanding of what's there with kind of leaning towards a lot of these we're probably going to acknowledge.
Right.
Unless there are just some blatant
Right.
infractions.
Oh, they're there.
Well, and that's going to be the discussion of.
Unfortunately, they're there.
Well, yeah, but.
Yeah, I know.
You know, they might have thought it was vacant. I mean, who knows why some of the stuff was built when it was built, right?
Well,
So do you have enough information to go forward?
Are you guys comfortable enough to get started? I think that we can start. Why don't we'll start and we'll bring back what we think are some of the easier ones. And maybe if there's things we identify that are like, okay, this is what we consider kind of questionable, and maybe we can have a discussion about that before we kind of go 100% full in. Maybe we can kind
Okay,
of
so
bring
we're
back
at the
a
end of
sampling.
October. Why don't we talk about, say the first meeting in February, give you guys some time.
Okay, why don't we do we'll try and get a sample. We won't probably nail all 70 plus.
Can you get some categories so we can?
Kind of look at them, and maybe we could have a
where
better
they are,
discussion at
'cause
that point.
I think that's critical.
Okay.
You know, again, you know, I have, like Dan said, I have an alley next to my house,
Yep.
but I do have a survey now. I know where my property line is, and that's why I'm not vacating the street next to me, because.
Okay, with that said, we're going to adjourn this meeting, and we're going to come back into order to the city commission meeting at 7:15.